Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to CGHE seminar number 258. And we're well into the 130s, I think, in the webinar series. And this is a terrific webinar to finish the year on. We weren't planning on making this the final one, actually, Sinyi and Hugh. We did have another webinar scheduled this week with a presenter from Saudi Arabia, and he didn't get permission from the Saudi Arabian Department of Education to appear in the webinar program, so he's had to withdraw. There you are. So autonomy is a wonderful thing, isn't it, when you've got it? Well, we're free to choose to be on this webinar, and here we are. Great topic, the death of human capital, its failed promise and how to renew it in an age of disruption, a major book by Cheung and Hugh Lauder and Phil Brown, following up the very famous Global Auction book that Hugh and Phil produced a few years back, which has been very influential. So we're looking to see what you've done with this, returning to the topic and reinvigorating human capital theory for us. We've spent a lot of time on this program bad-mouthing human capital theory, so it'll be good to have the sort of, not the other side, but another perspective on that very important and central problem in higher education. Now, before I introduce our presenters properly, let me take you through the webinar protocols. As you all know, if you're regulars, the webinar is recorded and it winds up on YouTube within a day or so, and we're finding that the YouTube version is being used a lot. And of course, it'll be there for all time. So whatever you say on the webinar will be enshrined on YouTube. Now, please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or asking a question during the webinar. And there's no need to have your video on either, really, during the webinar. Please do so. Someone's got the audio on. Please do so when asking a question, of course. Now, we recommend you use the speaker view setting in the top right-hand corner there with the big red arrow, so you can clearly see who is talking during the webinar. Now, to ask a question, and we strongly recommend that you do come into the Q&A. To ask a question, use the chat function. Write your question or your statement out there, and I'll select from the chat into the Q&A proper. And I'll give you a warning if we're about to bring you in to the Q&A discussion. Generally pays to put your question into the chat in the first 20 minutes or so after the speakers have stopped, because we can't always pick up the late interventions. The speaking list is usually full by the end. Now, when you're invited into the webinar to ask your question or make your statement, please unmute yourself. Most important, switch on your video and state your name and where you are from. Now, our presenters. Hugh Lauder, Professor of Education and Political Economy at the University of Bath since 1996, and a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. He's one of the co-authors of the book, The Death of Human Capital, which he will discuss today. And he's a much published authority on the junction between the economy and education. Cheung is Professor of Sociology, Co-Director of Research and Director of the MEAD, MEAD, Migration, Ethnicity, Race and Diversity Research Group in the School of Social Sciences at Cardiff University. Her research examines the transitions from education to employment, labour market inequalities, migration and refugee integration. Lots of interest in all those topic areas in our webinar series, Sinyi, so you'll be talking to people who are already having a conversation about your interests. She's also Editor-in-Chief of Frontiers in Sociology, Race and Ethnicity. And haven't we spent a long time during our webinar series in the last 12 months talking about race and racism, and perhaps the topic above all, which has galvanized interest around the world in the last 12 months. So without any further delay, can I hand over to Hugh to begin today's webinar?
Thank you very much, Simon. It's great to be with you all today. And I'll give you a little bit of background on the book. And Simon kind of gave the cue for that. He talked about the previous book that Phil Brown and David Ashton and I did, which was on the global auction. And after that book, in which we showed that there was a problem with graduate incomes in the West because of the auction of graduate work across the globe, but particularly in East Asia, we decided that we now needed to move on to the next step, which was to have a crack at human capital, because it didn't look as though it would stand up in the light of that earlier research that we'd done. So that was quite a daunting kind of prospect for us, because we were taking on one of the most entrenched theories in higher education and the economy, entrenched in for over 50 years. And at the same time, we were taking on a range of Nobel Prize winners for whom there was great authority, as it were, accorded to them. So the question then was, well, where do we start and how do we get into this? And if we could have the next slide, then we'll have a look at that. Now, one of the things that we wanted to do was, there'd been many critiques of human capital, including Simon's own early, very impressive work. And we decided that we wanted to look at the data in ways that hadn't been looked at before, and Sinyi will be talking about that shortly. And at the same time, we also wanted to try and develop some alternative account. Now, the alternative account was a question, because we wanted in some respects to be talking to economists. I think unless they're heterodox economists, that was a vague hope. However, so we wanted to talk about some kind of replacement for human capital, but at the same time, taking into account the fact that there needs to be some kind of connection, but certainly not the one articulated by human capital theory, between higher education and the labor market. So what we were doing there was trying to think about laying the groundwork for some alternative view, both of education and the labor market. So if we could move on to the next slide. Okay, so this project developed in 3 steps. First, we needed to account for the rise of human capital. Why was it so attractive? Why did it then continue for so long? And indeed still continues. We then wanted to talk about, well, why it shouldn't stand up, why it's actually a failed promise. And having talked about the failed promise of it, we wanted to sketch out what a new human capital theory might look like. And we should say that we need to see human capital theory not merely as a set of correlations between higher education qualifications and the labor market, but indeed it's a much broader theory, because it also takes into account and argues for, as it were, meritocracy. And I'll just deal with that shortly. So if we can move on to the next slide. In order to get an idea of how we could develop a new account, as it were, of this relationship, we needed to use an account which both critiqued the empirical work, but also looked at how we might be able to develop an alternative account. And for us, the breakthrough really turned on the issue of job scarcity. So human capital theory, and incidentally, higher education policy, certainly in this country, assumes that the fundamental and key point about human capital and prosperity that arises from human capital, which I'll talk about also, is labor scarcity. That there are jobs out there for graduates, if only higher education was trained to focus on what was most important in terms of getting a job. On the other hand, job scarcity focuses on the incapacity to generate enough good jobs for people within the context, the formal context of the labour market. And that's another issue that we wanted to be talking about. So we're talking about job scarcity within the labour market as it now is. Okay, next slide. So job scarcity. Now, one of the interesting things about both human capital theory and the kind of allied notion of a knowledge economy is that there was assumed that for two different reasons, that there would be an infinite demand for graduate labor. The two reasons are that one, supply of graduate labor would increase it or induce its own demand. And the other one was that in the knowledge economy, a rather vague term, in the knowledge economy, there would be an infinite demand for labor because of the new technological revolution. In this context, labor scarcity is the exception rather than the rule. And that's an important point because most of the human capital theorists and their followers, the skill-biased technical change theorists, assume that the fundamental issue in relation to rewards in the labor market turns on the question of labor scarcity, not job scarcity. There are two other points to be made. The first is that we don't view human capital as a form of capital. In fact, it's a misnomer. What we do talk about is the way in which human beings might be able to capitalize on whatever abilities and talents they might have, and they can be of many different sorts, not the formal ones of the higher education production line, as it were, that we need to take into account and think about. And we need to also challenge the idea that learning equals earning, because if you have job scarcity, then learning will certainly not equal earning. Okay, next slide. So I think there are three challenges here. The first was to do with education. And like, as with many people in higher education, the idea that of following human capital theory, that education should simply be there to get people good jobs is highly questionable. And it's highly questionable because, of course, education has a range of things that or aims that it should seek to achieve. And they're not only to do with the nature of work, they're also to do with democracy, they're to do with development, they're to do with a range of other factors. And of course, I suppose right now, climate change would be the most dominant of all. And just as a matter of note, it's interesting that school children have refused to carry on working and walked out of many schools across the world in order to protest against the lack of progress with climate change and addressing it. The next point, I guess, is to do with technology. And so while we look at human capital theory, we also look at skill-biased technical change theory, which builds technology into, as it were, a kind of human capital theory, and argue and raise the question, in fact, does technology raise the demand for skilled workers? And I think that once you move away from the idea of a knowledge economy, which is a kind of technicist view, to one in which we look at knowledge capitalism, then you see that actually what knowledge capitalism seeks is cut price brain power. Brain power is expensive and they want it to be as cheap as possible. Then there's a distributional challenge. Who learns what and when? And this will come back to issues of inequality, of course, which extend to the labor market. Who does what? Who has what opportunity to make the best of the talents and abilities that they might have? And who gets what? And under those, all those three things are answered by human capital theory. And in each case, they just happen to be wrong or highly questionable to put it less emphatically. So time is also running out for us, not only in terms of this presentation, but in terms of climate change. So we need to move on a bit. So let's move on to the next slide. So what are the key assumptions underlying human capital theory? The first is, as we've indicated, that this high-tech revolution will see a rise in the demand for high-skilled, high-paid work. And that's Gary Becker, and it's also the skill-based technical change people like David Orter and Darren Acemoglu. Now, the key here is that education is assumed to raise the productivity of workers. And therefore, the more educated a person is, the more likely, once they've gone through education, that they will earn a higher income because they are more productive. And then crucially here in relation to meritocracy, employers as rational actors will hire the most able, irrespective of their social background. And one of the interesting things about the developments of more recent, more narrow, you might say, pragmatic human capital theory research is that it demonstrates very clearly that those assumptions about inequality in the labor market simply don't operate. Not like that at all. Okay, so they're the three key assumptions. We'll move on now to the next slide. And these are to do with the causal assumptions. And I've kind of indicated them already, but just to go through them. The first one is a kind of Say's law assumption that supply will generate its own demand. And of course, in neoliberal societies, the focus therefore comes on to higher education. And higher education is seen as the supplier of not only educated labor, which will be more highly productive, but that this will raise the income of both the individuals involved, but also the society. And when I mention the individuals, notice that under neoliberal societies, some kind of distinction is made, which is a bit like trying to work out angels on a pinhead, between that which is a benefit to the society as a whole and that which is a benefit of the individual. And that's another assumption that we simply reject. And then there's the supply and demand argument by skill-based technical change theorists, particularly Claudia Golden and Lawrence Katz in a famous book, in which they argue that technology is driving up demand, but that if we want to narrow the income inequalities, we need more skilled labor because what we had at the moment, and they were talking about 2008, 2009, what they were referring to there was the idea that the inequalities in terms of graduate incomes between and those who are non-graduate was very high because there was simply not enough skilled graduates in the labor force. On that point, I shall now hand over to Cheung, who will look at some of the empirical work and some of the issues to do with, well, where do we go from here in the presentation.
Thank you, Hugh. Yes, thanks, Trevor. That's exactly the slide that I need. Just wanted to echo Hugh. Thank you very much for inviting us to give this talk. I couldn't think of a better venue to air some of these critique and arguments, being the Global Center of Higher Education, and very honored and delighted to be invited and share some of our thoughts and comments on this what we consider very important topic. So, as Hugh said earlier, that we are taking a very daunting task, Nobel Prize winner, whatnot, and in order to examine some of the assumptions of human capital theory, we need to look at data. And that's basically what we spend the middle part of the book, 4 chapters talking about. So do we believe, given such an important drive in the public policy and World Bank and all government policy in the last 50 years, do we actually believe, do their claims hold up And certainly economies are famous in running all these fantastic econometric models and using very fancy statistics. But do we actually understand them? And so we set ourselves the task to use data in an accessible way and look at some of the assumptions behind human capital theory. So we came up with this idea that learning isn't equals earning. So we can only actually, given the time, we can only actually pick a few findings that to share with you today at the whistle-stop tour. So we looked at income earnings in the labor market, comparing four-year college graduates using the US data in the first step, and high school graduates. And we look at income labor market earnings in the labor market rather than any other sources of income. Comparing those with comparing four-year college graduates and high school graduates, and looking using the 10% percentile and the top 90% percentile and the median. So the idea of a graduate premium advocated by human capital theorists is that the notion that graduates actually earn a lot more over the lifetime compared to people without a degree, a college degree certainly. And but if you look at the top decile and the bottom decile, and as we can see in these two graphs presented the findings by men and women separately. And the y-axis is actually US dollars in 2019 consumer price index equivalized. So and the y-axis is also actually identical, 70 from $0 to $70. So you can see very clearly that women consistently earn less than men, regardless whether they're college graduates or high school graduates. And then we can see that in over the 4 decades since 1970s to 2010, real wage growth is pretty stagnant for most of these graduates, whether they have a college degree or high school degree, diploma or not, with the exception of the top 10% of the college graduates, and particularly applies to men. So, and we looked at it by age, by race and ethnicity, and also, next slide, please. Thank you. And this is the picture that we can present looking at different ethnic groups, again, using the US data, spanning over a 40-year period of time, and comparing all the groups to non-Hispanic whites, Blacks, Native American, and we can see that the groups, with the exception of Chinese and Japanese, all groups do far worse than non-Hispanic whites in the US. So, and the left-hand side panel, we can see that higher education expansion over this same period of time, everybody gets a higher share. All the ethnic groups or racial groups have a much higher proportion have a degree, particularly among the Chinese and Japanese East Asian groups in the US. No surprises there. And you can see there's 3 years of all the bars where the growth would, but with noticeable lagging behind the 3 groups of Blacks, Native Americans, and Latin Americans. So this is showing that the higher education expansion, the growth does not benefit everybody equally. And the right-hand side panel is unemployment rate of 4-year college graduates. And again, it's showing a big rise in unemployment rate since the 70s, the golden period of what we call golden period of human post-oil crisis in the 70s, where the economy is growing. And that was the golden era of human capital, if they ever had one. And unemployment, even among the graduates, shot up in between the 90s and 2010, those 2 decades, and particularly acute for Black and Native American groups in Latin America, even among the Chinese and Japanese, despite they are so well qualified. So compared to non-Hispanic whites, we see that there's a stark contrast. So what happened to the earnings then? Please, next slide, please. So if we compare college graduate median using So everybody knows that who deals with statistics, even at the most elementary level, we know that using mean earnings is by far the most misleading picture. So most of the time we look at median income, and that gives it the center value. So it's a bit less, but not entirely free from being affected by outliers, with the top 1% highest earner among the CEOs and company directors. So if we look at the college median graduates, median earners, compared with the high school leavers at the top 90% percentile, the returns to the human capital investment is by far from equal. So if they are approximately the same, all the bars should be identical. They should be flat across the top. So with the jagged line, we can see that compared to the non-Hispanic whites or the far left gray bar, the college graduate median earners are consistently doing worse than high school graduates earning in the 90th percentile income bracket. And of course, people may argue that a plumber inheriting a business from the father will do far less without a college degree. They can just leave school after high school. And that applies to most self-employed people, petty bourgeois and farmers. But for the most part, if you look at self-employed people, they constitute a very small percentage of labor market and employees, certainly. So compare like with like employees, certainly graduates, and not everyone reaps the benefit of the huge investment they invest, their whole family's wealth, putting all the savings, lifetime saving, to send their kids to colleges. So if you have more than one kid, so you have to save up a lot more. So again, this picture is continually present a very persistent picture of not everyone is equal. And the labor market is highly stratified. We know that. So among economists and quantitative sociology, stratification research, everybody has been doing this and showing this similar pattern over and over again, but without actually going back to the heart of the human capital theory, tackling the very assumption that more education means higher productivity and higher earnings in the labor market. So what's worse is this is not just happening in the West, UK, US, and any rich liberal democracies in the West. Next slide, please. One of the big assumptions further pushes the World Bank and OECD countries to this, how influential this policy, this theory in influencing global policy. I can't think of another policy that has been so influential. National investment in education will lead to faster and better economic growth. Is another assumption rests heavily relied by human capital theorists, and we have more room to deal with it in the book. So if we look at just taking OECD countries, low and middle income countries compared to the high income countries, we can see that, I give the headlines, it's quite difficult to see from a very small screen. Low and middle income countries like Kenya, Malaysia, and Morocco, and India, they don't invest any less in education as part of the expenditure of, as a share of the government gross domestic product for the national expenditure on education. And yet we know that compared to the high flyers, the Eastern Tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, and certainly in India, China, they don't actually spend any less in education, but economic growth, yes, seriously. So not all the countries would promise investment in higher education, expansion in higher education will push and stimulate economic growth. And worse than that is a double whammy. And human capital theories, if it was enjoying the golden era in the 70s and 80s, it certainly was based on the very huge assumptions that people don't move. And in the global era of transnational movements, international migration, not only that the highest qualified people actually seek the best opportunities in the world. I'm sure there will be lots of you in this call actually working in a country is not actually the one that you were born in. So it's all very well for these countries to invest in the human capital at a national level, but people move, and people move where the jobs are. So they move, and so for all this human capital investment at the national level, the benefit is being reaped by another country, and quite often, more often than not, these countries are the richest in the world. So hence, we're seeing a brain drain phenomenon. And what do we mean by human arbitrage? We know that no matter how qualified you are, and as we have seen in the previous slides, ethnic minorities, even among the best performing ethnic minorities, Chinese and Japanese, East Asians in the US, and Chinese Indian in the UK, given their qualification, they still suffer what I've written about what we call ethnic penalty in the labor market. Given their qualification, they still not earning as much as they should have done. So given their highest given their highest level of investment in human capital at both at individual and national level, again, their wages returns in the labor market actually compare very not very favorably to the non-Hispanic whites or certainly white in this country, and so it is not a level playing field as human capital theorists have a belief. So just not laboring the point, I think we've seen just a smattering of empirical evidence to give you the highlights of what we dealt with in the book, and we don't need to actually prove it. We just need to cast enough doubt about it, whether it actually works. It's quite serious and troubling readings, we find, and the more we look at the evidence, the more we feel troubled by these developments and trends over time. And we find that it's not just in Western liberal democracies, but also globally, anyone who invests in human capital at the individual and national level. Next slide, please. So we're coming up to the final part of the book. So what next? So with Ditch, we started this demolition project, or trying to dismantle this hugely influential human capital theory. What's the alternative? And we spend the best part of part 3 trying to come up with an alternative. Education should not be about just getting a job, and I'm sure that we're preaching to the converted here. Education, the new vision that we call the new human capital model, it leads to what we consider double transformation, is liberating the human, putting the human back in from the learning, and liberating the human from the tyranny of earning, and getting a job and earning a good income should only be a byproduct of education, particularly higher education. And it's much broader than just human capital. Once reduce it to something that can be marketized, and much broader base, including social, cultural, and scientific benefit. The indirect benefit of higher education shouldn't be dismissed offhand. And if students couldn't blame higher education for not making them productive enough, and higher education isn't really responsible for the creation of good jobs, and those metrics judge university by the employability of the graduates should be dismissed. And the vision of higher education in the future going forward is an inclusive and free from any kind of form of discrimination and stratification. Now, without human capital theory, it would be far harder to scapegoat universities for not teaching well enough, and which has been the go-to blame game of the past 50 years or so. And human capital theory as a fair alternative to industrial policy and impaired equitable social development is I believe that we have done beginning to do to show it is highly questionable. But our job is not done. And we're imagining a world beyond human capital theory, which has, I said that before, functioned as a failed promise alternative to industrial policy. And the constraint of the power of just education that liberates us from the earning and being the slave to a job. So a better world, perhaps, where we are putting the human back in to learning and education. We'll stop there, and I can see some questions are coming in already. Thank you very much.
Simon, shall I just respond to one question, which was from Ellen Hazelcorn?
Hugh, I've got a speaking order. I'm sorry.
Okay,
I do
sorry, no, that's fine. Go
That's
for
okay.
it.
No, I've been telling people in the chat, you know, when they're coming in and so on. So I better stick to that. We'll bring in Ellen, and you'll be able to talk about policy implications, I'm sure. Well, I mean, thanks very much to both of you. You know, we don't have an equivalent of the Nobel Prize, but the CGHE Prize for Economic Science would certainly this month would definitely go to the two of you. That was very illuminating and rather depressing, of course, as it, you know, when you look at income distribution and racializations data in the economy, it's always a bad picture, but it's certainly got worse since 1990, hasn't it? In several respects. The notion that you can judge university courses and institutions by their graduate employment rates or their salaries, graduate salaries, is outrageous. It's what we have as the predominant indicator now in the UK. I mean, all that's doing, it seems to me, is judging, is finding as inferior first generation students who are coming in from relatively poor disadvantaged backgrounds, don't have lots of social and cultural capital to play with in the labour market after graduation, don't have high salaries, don't have particularly high rates of employment, but it suddenly looks like they're low value people doing low value courses, and you know the low value people part is the nasty part. We'll go straight to our call list, and we'll bring in Alil Cohen first. Alil, can you come in, please?
Thanks very much, Simon. Thanks so much for that. That was really fascinating. I think some of the later questions are a bit kind of bigger and juicier, so I'll just be really, really quick. And just that on that slide about the national investment equals economic growth slide, where you shared some, you included government expenditure. I just quick question around how that might look if you did include private expenditure on education, and how does that change that picture? I know it's only a relatively minor part of the narrative, so I don't need to spend too long on it. Thank you.
You can choose who wants to answer that.
Oh, yes, I can try to have a go. Yes, very good point. Obviously, when we talk about investment in education, we actually started with private investment. So the student pays model of students, and we mean parents pay model. So if you have 3 kids going to college, then you're in trouble. So I completely agree if you look at private investment and all this private tuition. But the whole argument, human capital theory rests upon is individuals pay, not government. So the national, that is a second argument about the promise that national investment leads to economic growth. But on the individual level, we started actually is private investment of education, and which means the national growth argument is to justify a tolerable public expenditure on higher education. Whereas the central argument, human capital theory, is still rests on individuals' investment. So it is not. So if you want to earn more in the labour market, and they're dangling this promise in front of you, then you must invest in your own human capital, and that's where the argument lies. And we don't see those two arguments as conflicting to each other. So,
thank you.
Thanks, Inyi. Can we now have us? Who's our second? Peter Scott is our second person in the Q&A. Peter.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you both for the presentation. I mean, you've completely convinced me that we need to switch the emphasis from kind of labour scarcity to kind of job scarcity. And underlying that, of course, is a fundamental difference of view about society, whether we should put emphasis on democracy and individual rights, or whether we should put it on the functioning of markets. But I want to ask two questions which are about people who aren't convinced by this. The first is, how do you persuade university leaders to stop, or at least cease to rely so heavily on selling the case for investment in higher education, whether it's by the state or whether it's by individuals, on the fact that it pays off somehow? It's going to pay off for you in terms of earnings or in productivity in relation to the state. That's the first question. And the second question is, how do you resist the conclusion that some politicians of some kinds might draw, that actually, well, the solution to this is actually, well, we'll just cut back on higher education and the number of places available to students? How do we actually handle that in a way tactically rather than intellectually?
If I could come in on that, Peter, these are very good questions. And we realize that in terms of your second question, what we're doing here is pretty dangerous. Because that is what the right wing would say. Only those who are really able and go to elite universities should get an education. Part of the problem with that, of course, is they don't then say, well, actually, there are really good jobs of an intermediate level that people can gain if they only go to further education or community colleges. And that in itself is a fundamental question of its own. But in terms of vice chancellors, that's a really tricky question, because vice chancellors have gone along with neoliberalism because they see it as a source of income. So it's a two-edged sword for them. On the one hand, by playing that game, they continue to bring in money. But on the other hand, when you look at the data, and the data is more variable when you look at it more closely. But when you look at that data, you've got to start asking the question, which we have. My view is that vice chancellors should be talking about all the other things that education does, rather than just simply focusing on getting a good job. My view is, this is my personal view, is that with the advent of various forms of AI and other new technologies, the question about automatically getting a job is going to be highly problematic, which is why we also need to widen our understanding of who gets what and on what basis of reward in our society. And that could, for example, include a universal basic income.
Can I just come in on that and just very briefly elaborate that point? It is precisely the job scarcity argument is, we looked at the data by occupation in one of the chapters. It's not software engineers and software designers in Cupertino who's earning a lot more, according to the skills bias technological change argument. Those are the people, those are the fastest growing occupation, and because of technological changes, we need more highly skilled knowledge workers in our labor markets. But looking at the growth in terms of the number of these employees, as well as the growth in real term wages in real terms, they are not the actually people who are actually the top 10% or 1%. This continues to be medical doctors, lawyers, and CEOs, and which has fairly, yeah, they do need to go to, some of these people need to go to college to be a doctor and lawyer, certainly, but the majority of the graduates don't. So HE doesn't pay for the majority of people. I think our data actually amply showing that. The second point is the job scarcity is a lot of these elite occupation, they have a very highly regulated by the industry itself, the number of employees. And so the lawyers, you can't just get a degree to be a lawyer, you have to pass certain tests. So by regulating the demand, they keep the wages high. And so it's nothing to do with what higher education can do or cannot do. But government continues to, certainly the UK government continue, it's not just the right wing people on the right actually argue that we shouldn't we should introduce tuition fee, we should make student pay because they earn more after they graduate. Even people on the left say that, because why we know that middle class students are more likely to go to universities than those from the working class background. Why should we continue to subsidize middle class students? So we are actually presenting as a dangerous argument for people to hop on the bandwagon to say that, oh, you can't actually subsidize all these rich kids to go to universities because working class students still lose out. And therefore, the universal basic income idea will go some way to start addressing some of the issues here. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you both. And let's bring in Simon Warren at this point. Simon.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you both for the, for the work that is now contained in the book and for the presentation. Always thoughtful, always robust, always provocative. Thank you. And I'm really pleased that you are kind of looking to the wider political economy for some of the responses to this critique of human capital theory. But my question, I suppose, is partly a response to your reimagining of human capital theory, but also I think it's related to Peter Scott's question as well, which is that human capital theory has been drawn upon as a legitimizing discourse to legitimate particularly public funding of mass higher education. And that's and within Denmark, which is where I'm based, human capital theory is drawn upon to justify mass higher education, but it's used to justify the racialization of higher education politics and policy. That the human capital should be the human capital of the Danish ethnos, and we need to be careful of foreigners stealing our our human capital. So it's used in all sorts of ways. So if we're reimagining human capital theory, and to me that kind of raises questions about what the purpose then that we think higher education has, might this also require a rethinking of the apparently progressive arguments for mass higher education? In that I think, although progressives have joined the campaign to open up access, I don't think the drive for mass higher education is necessarily and essentially a progressive phenomena. But it's something that we've tried to make progressive. So should we reimagine the very idea of mass higher education and instead pick up some of the themes that you've discussed, where it's about conceptualizing the relationship between education, different forms of education, different notions of being educated, and human well-being that is not tied to privileging one form of educational institutionalization over another.
I'll have a first crack, Simon, then see you can have a crack as well. I think you raised a very important point there. And when you look at the critiques of meritocracy that have come out in the last 2 years or so, what you see there is there's a deep resentment of the educated. So, for example, in America, I think around 58% of Republicans who voted for Trump thought that colleges, in other words, universities, were actually bad for the country. So when you look at that, and that's to do with a kind of degree of resentment and the view that people who don't have a university degree look down on those people. So there clearly is a kind of rebalancing that is required. And that rebalancing may well include some kind of notion of parity of esteem, it should, between different routes through post-compulsory education. So absolutely. And there are interesting things that these are only small straws in the wind. But if you look at, for example, the German apprenticeship system, when you look at, for example, the ordinances for their professions, take, for example, mechatronics, they've had for years in that an awareness of climate and climate change and the environmental impact. And those sorts of broader notions of education, I think, should be built in to community colleges in the States, further education in this country and the equivalents around the world. In other words, that we're providing a broad education, which may then also focus on a particular vocation, but that we understand vocation much more widely than this very small technical sense of the term. Cindy?
I am fascinated by the comments and questions in the chat. So I didn't actually pay a lot of attention to your answer. I did listen to Simon's question, though. I think it's very important, and Ryan chimes in one of the other comment in the chat about human capital theory provides a case for public investment in education, and we don't actually deny the fact that national investment to a point in education lift people out of poverty in lower and middle income countries, but also it's the wider what we call social benefits of higher education has been kind of destined to kind of brush aside, to reduce to almost something to zero. What's left is what's marketized, can be marketable. And investment, it's interesting, the Denmark case and the German case that Hugh was talking about stands in stark contrast to the UK approach and to the US approach. Biden's administration continues to advocate, I think it's one of his election campaign, is to make 2-year community college free, completely free of charge. So, and I can't help but think that it's a kind of cynical move, because that's the cheapest way of providing mass education. That's not really a 4-year college degree, and there's some figures in the book about how much worse off these 2 years college graduates are also doing, because they have to pay to go to these for-profit college. There's quite a big literature on that as well in the US, and also the UK government, precisely the argument, the graduate tax is premise on this human capital theory, because you earn more when you graduate, so it's your duty to pay it back. You pay your share to your own education, because you are the one who ultimately benefit. So it goes both ways, and we see that it's not an easy a way to think of a way. We can't will ourselves into existence. We've begun this demolition. We present an alternative, and as I said earlier, our job is not done. There's so much more to be thinking about, to come up with a better alternative and narrative, and some of the questions I don't have an immediate answer to, like what about students' agency? What about education externalities? And thanks to the question from Francis Green, which I picked up. But anyway, I leave the chair back to Simon.
Yeah, I've got a speaking list. Thanks, Sinyi, and thanks, Hugh. Now, what we'll do now is bring in people in pairs. I think we've got time for 2 more brackets. We usually run to about 5 past before the audience disappears. So we'll have Ellen Hazelcorn and Emma Saliva together now. Ellen, can you come in, please?
Yeah, hi. Very interesting discussion, and I liked your previous book as well. So I'm interested in the implications of all this, and Peter has raised this, and so the previous question also. I work with a lot of governments, big issue. You look at issues around skills gap, relevance is a big issue, mismatch is a big, obviously a big World Bank issue. But so I'm wondering if your argument really is about expanding in a much more expansive understanding of tertiary education. Is that where you're going with this because of the breadth of it? Now, I don't quite agree that further education or the community college is a cheap version. I think that we need to look at it as a much broader issue. And I think Biden's issue, which was Obama's, is quite an interesting counter to this issue of free university. But I'm wondering if really that's what this argument is. So what is the answer on the policy side? What's the answer in terms of where should we? Because we've spent a lot of time trying to get people into university and have ignored the other arguably 50% of the population. This is some of these people you refer to as now voting for Trump. Is it a critique of elite universities? I'm just really trying to see where these policy implications are and what you propose we substitute.
So hold your answer, Hugh. I'll bring in Emma.
Thank you.
Sebzaliva at this point as well. Emma.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Ellen, also just for bringing up this notion of the skills gap, which is one that I hear a lot, and it doesn't sit comfortably with me. And I feel that there should be some very direct resonance with what you're saying in the book, and you indicated with the presentation today. So really my question is an invitation to comment on how you see this idea, this trope perhaps of the skills gap, and how that connects with the arguments that you're putting forward in the book. Thank you very much.
Okay, Hugh and
if I could begin, Ellen, a number of points. First of all, I think the view we'd take is that both community college or FE college and universities should be free. And that might sound like pie in the sky if you're in the Treasury in London, for example, but actually it requires some serious thinking and serious work. And this is not merely about the cost. When you think of countries like Germany, where it is free, and I don't know about Denmark, but I imagine it would be close to free. So the question is, why do we then charge fees? That's really the question. And it's based on this kind of false assumption that you can divide up between individual benefit and social benefit. So that then gives you a clue as to the broader notion of both university education and indeed let's call them further education colleges, and why that's important. And Sinya's made the point that the idea that the wealthy who go to university will already benefit. Well, my personal view is that we've got a Braverman-esque type proletarianization of graduates going on, as some of our data indicates, not all of it. But when you then lever in AI and the other forms of technological innovation which are now coming in, I think we need to look much more carefully at this simple idea that you'll get graduates to pay for this. And of course, if that goes, then so does the office for the office for students, and the idea that you need to hold universities to account for jobs, which is just economically illiterate for reasons I can unpack at some other time. Let me then come on to Emma's point. In a capitalist society, you will always get skills mismatches. It's almost tautological. And they're not unimportant because you do need to be able to match in some way educated workers of one sort or another with jobs. However, let us notice that in the past, it's employers that have done that. And now we have plug-in and play demands from employers for graduates. And so the question of what a mismatch is itself highly controversial and not to be taken at face value. But the key point in our book, and you're quite right about this, is that actually we don't have good enough jobs. And that's where the major mismatch is.
I say something very quickly here. Thank you for all the very thought-provoking questions. University, human capital theory has provided a very, very strong rationale for university to close humanities departments, and because poetry writing is not economically productive. And so we're turning, this is a tendency that we're turning universities into vocational training colleges rather than the other way around, rather than more research elite universities. And the broader articulation of education, further or higher education, it really is needed. We need to knock it in the head. And the pandemic actually really knocks it on the head for us, because care workers are key workers, social and healthcare, and those skills are actually quite to some quite high skill jobs, and certainly important life and death jobs, and yet they consider very low skill work and certainly pay pittance. And compared to someone sitting in the boardroom with air conditioning in a very hot country, so we continue, human capital theory continue to give us the scapegoating. Education is not doing well enough for people to have good jobs. So that shackle has to go, and we don't have all the answers to what the government should do in investing which kind of education, but a rethink is definitely is a very, very urgent thing that we all need to be doing. And I don't have all the answers, I'm afraid.
The last two questions for 2021 will come from Francis Green and James Robson. So Francis, are you there? Hello, Francis.
Here I am.
There he is.
Thank you.
Hi, Francis.
Hello, everybody. Well, I wrote down a question about methodological individualism, which I regard as one of the key planks of human capital theory, and wanted to ask how important you saw it as in part of this argument. I'm sure you will say yes, but may I also ask a provocative question? Have you ever presented this argument to a bunch of mainstream economists? And if so, how did they react?
Hugh, you can answer that. You went to Harvard, didn't you?
Yeah.
I've got James Robson as well, so we'll just bring in James. James, you've got the last question.
Thank you. Hi, all. James Robson from Oxford University. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. And yeah, I think this is such an important critique of human capital theory. It's very strong and clear. I think what's really interesting about the book is how to renew it. That part, which maybe didn't get quite as much discussion as could have been had in this talk. But I'm wondering, for all of the talk about fees and students and the focus on the individual, whether or how to capture the teaching research nexus, the research part of what universities do. And well, we need to rethink the relationship between higher education and the labour market beyond human capital theory, or having a different approach to human capital theory. How can we capture that research element within that rethinking? And I'm talking about sort of high skills ecosystems, spillovers, which drive different kinds of regional economies. Thank you.
Yep. Well, let me answer Francis's question. One bit of it's easy, one bit of it's hard, and then we'll come on to James. The point about the individualism, I think a key plank of our argument, and it needs more development, is that the idea that you can distinguish between the individual and their returns from those to the society as a whole is highly problematic. And you only have to look, for example, at the pandemic to give a kind of clear example, and look at the key workers in that pandemic that we are going through right now, and the rewards to those key workers, some of which are very low paid, irrespective of their skills. And you realize that underlying this distinction is one about certain values which are attributed to the labor market. And perhaps we need to go much further than that right now when we think about those things. Francis, I can happily tell you that I've given presentations to economists in Berlin, I've given them at Harvard, and I've given them at Oxford. And wherever I've been, they've gone, oh, very interesting. Well, of course, you're quite right about the canonical theory, but you just haven't kept up with how theories have developed since. And so first of all, we had skill bias technical change theory from Harvard. We addressed that in a paper in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy. And then we moved on to Otto Levy and Manane, the ALM theory, which is a pretty crude theory. And I have a PhD student now who's brilliantly taking that apart. So wherever we go, we're always told that we're not up to date. Yeah, good. I think we've probably maybe just hurdled a few of those objections. I'm not so sure. To come to James's point, I mean, that's not to say, Francis, as you know, there is much work being done through the IFS and others on the particular returns for particular subjects in this country now. And I think, as Sinyi indicated, we're going down a rabbit hole with that. If, for example, and I keep saying this, but let me just say it one more time, you need to look at different labor markets. If you look at the labor market for creative workers, by and large, on average, they earn very little, but that's a winner-takes-all market. Now, unless you're going to restructure that market, the idea that just because people are getting a low return doesn't mean there isn't a national return, which there clearly is a fundamental point. So put that to one side. James, I think the points you're making are very important. And they're really important in terms of understanding the value of universities. But at the same time, the point you make about regional analysis and regional development of policy, where you might get a much better match, as it were, between what universities and other colleges are doing in relation to the local economy, I think is very, very important. And that's the direction I think we should be going in.
Final thoughts, and those are very thoughtful questions. And if I understood you correctly, and I am sure that yeah, the answer is yes, that there are very important social determinants of educational choices people make. Some of these are preceded by occupational aspirations and others not. So I would like to go back to the point that labor market outcomes and whether you get a job or earn enough money to for a living should be a byproduct of education. So I would like to reinforce the point about education makes me happy, learning makes me healthier, and the society will be healthier, and all the wider social benefits haven't really, we all know that, but just haven't been written enough about, coming back to your point, James. And because human capital theory is so bloody dominant, that's all we talk about. That's what all governments are talking about. That's all university vice chancellors are worrying about, how much money our graduates are making, how much of them are in employment, how many of them are not underemployed, and all measured by some very oversimplified metrics. So I would like to disaggregate, or even actually try to not knock it on the head. It is not. Let's talk a bit less about the link between education and the labor market, and because this is not university's job to create desirable, decent employment. There is a very different system regulating the labor market, and in Germany and Denmark and Finland, and they're doing far better, and Sweden and doing far better than most of us. So again, I don't have all the answers, but and thank you for all your very thought-provoking questions. And give us a lot to think about. I would like to have a copy of the chat so that I can study them when I have a bit more time.
Yeah, we'll post the chat on the CG website. You'll be able to download that without any problem. Thanks, Sinyi, and thanks, Hugh. I thought that was an outstanding webinar, and you really opened a lot of doorways in our minds there. And we haven't got the full time we need to fully discuss some of these issues, but it occurs to me that it will be a good idea for us to run a longer series on higher education and the economy, rethinking the relationship. There's a number of people here in this webinar and outside it who could contribute to that. But I'd see the two of you and perhaps Phil Brown, if he can come in, as really central players in that discussion. You can see that there's tremendous interest. We could have gone on for another half hour at least on the basis of what was coming into the chat. And I mean, people are looking for something broader than what they're getting. And it's the discussion in the UK and elsewhere has become very constrained, and it's time to blow it open in the way that you're doing. But I think that we can provide you with a larger, platform, new connections, if you like. We'd really welcome your further engagement. I want to thank all the people who've sent nice season's greetings in. through the chat. It's been a fabulous year for us in the CGHE webinar series, the second year of it. We began in the pandemic at the beginning in April, and it's been a really successful series where, I mean, we peaked at 95 or so today. That's fantastic for mid-December. And I've got no doubt it was the topic and the speakers that drew that, but you know, I really thank everyone who came in today and participated. Look forward to next year, and we've got a really important first up webinar next year with Chris Millward talking to us about widening participation, his reflections after a very important period, carrying the responsibility for that brief at the Office for Students. Chris is now going to the University of Birmingham in a few days' time. His webinar will be responded to by Vicky Bolivar from Durham, who will have plenty of things to say as well. So I think that'll be a really good webinar on the 11th of January. So do come back to us then, and Sinyi and Hugh, please come back. We really welcome your contribution, and I think we now have to buy the book, so which will be music to your ears. We authors don't sell very well these days, but you know, your books do, and I do think that that people will take a lot of interest in this one. We just have to get the word around. So thank you very much to Trevor Trehan, who keeps this series going above all, and does it so well, so mistake-free, so quickly, so responsively, and at such a high level of quality. So thank you, Trevor. Without you, of course, we don't have this wonderful webinar series. And thank you to all my colleagues at CG who've contributed markedly on many occasions to the series and to the discussion and in the chat. And CG continues to be a vibrant research centre. We've got another almost 2 years to run in the present funding period, and we hope to obtain funding for a further 5 years after that. Well, fingers crossed. It's a big ask, but we're going to give it our best shot. So we look forward to seeing everyone in 2022. And meanwhile, have a really good break. Make the best use of the time at a personal level and at a professional level, and stay safe, and make sure you get that booster. Bye for now.
Thanks very much, Simon.
Thank you so much for organising this, and thank you for all the wonderful questions. It's a lot to think about going forward.
Thanks, Inye. Thanks, you.